The politics of lifting mask mandates and a profanity-laced confrontation between state lawmakers on the House floor. Those are just some of the stories for our Spotlight Politics team. Welcome back. Amanda Venicky, Heather Sharon, and Paris Schutz. So let's start with the politics of COVID. Chicago is aligning with Governor Pritzker's statewide end of the mask and vaccine mandates on Monday. Cook County is following suit. Heather, masking, though, it's not ending in all places just yet, right?
That's right. You will still have to wear a mask on public transportation, in hospitals, and in other congregate care settings. Those are rules set by the federal government that the city, the county, and the state don't have the power to lift. And according to the Centers for Disease Control, all of Chicago and all of Illinois, for that matter, remains at a state of substantial transmission of COVID-19. So they recommend that everyone wear a mask indoors, regardless of what the rules in the city and state say.
Now, masking, of course, will continue at Chicago Public Schools as part of the agreement between the district and the union. But many school districts have gone mask optional. Paris, is this confusing, divisive?
Well, it certainly has been confusing and divisive across the state, as I believe more than a majority now are mask optional and have gotten rid of the mask mandate. But at CPS, probably a little less divisive. I think parents understand the union dynamics at play, so CPS is going to keep their mask mandate because of the labor agreement between CPS and CTU that keeps it in play. Teachers want to make sure that the vaccination rates for the youngest students lift a little bit before they're comfortable removing that mandate. It should also be noted that the Archdiocese of Chicago announced it will lift its mask mandate for its schools with the city on Monday. Probably been a little more controversial within that system than it has been in the CPS.
And a reminder, Paris, you just mentioned, of course, parents understanding the dynamic with CTU. Those teachers walked out for 4 days in order to get to this agreement. That includes the masking that maintains it in Chicago public schools. Heather, the mayor's vaccine mandate, though, for Chicago police, that was upheld. Do you know how many officers could be fired for not getting the vaccine?
Well, we don't know. The latest data from the city shows that about 3,100 officers have either told the city that they are not vaccinated or they've refused to tell the city at all whether they've been vaccinated or not. So those officers are at risk of discipline and termination. And we asked the mayor today what would happen. Was she concerned about that? And she said, as we heard earlier in the show, that she hopes that this decision, which was hotly opposed by the Fraternal Order of Police, really sends a signal that this debate is over and that they need to get vaccinated to keep their jobs.
And Amanda, Governor Pritzker, though, he's also pursuing his appeal to the state's Supreme Court to keep school masking in place as public officials are dropping these health mandates in the city. What's this all about?
Well, so this is going back to a Sangamon County judge order that allowed this kind of chaos to reign and really had schools decide for themselves. The governor has long maintained that his executive order should remain in place, but it's not as if the state really has an enforcement mechanism. He's asking the state's high court to take this up in an expedited fashion. The Supreme Court doesn't have to, nor do we have any timeline for that. And frankly, it almost seems as if the cat's sort of out of the bag, particularly with the statewide mask mandate lifting on the 28th. Nonetheless, the governor says that this is important because he's making the case to the state's Supreme Court that not being able to enforce a mandate and put that down in schools is going to hamper his administration's ability to protect individuals and to fight against the pandemic. And especially so, he says this has to be settled in case there is another surge, there's another variant, or God forbid, another pandemic in some fashion.
Now, Woodstock State Representative Stephen Reich had a profanity-laced confrontation with State Representative Lakeisha Collins over House masking rules. Heather, what happened?
Well, Lakeisha Collins named him as one of the Republican lawmakers who refused to wear a mask and asked that he be sanctioned and removed from the chamber. But that wasn't accurate. And before the measure was passed, his name was removed from it. But that didn't stop Reich from going up to Representative Collins and sort of putting his finger in her face. And afterwards, she said that he used a profanity and that she felt very threatening. It was really sort of the apex of the growing consternation and controversy and conflict conflict over the masks on the floor of the General Assembly since they came back into session earlier this month.
Now, Amanda, he's apologized. Legislative leaders have told their members to turn the temperature down a bit on this. But what kind of damage do confrontations like this do to the already strained relationship across the aisle?
Across the aisle, and actually, Brendis, I think it's within parties as well. There is a lot of feuding. There's a lot of frustration. This is some pretty tense stuff. Some of the things that you're seeing play out in schools, in families even, are likewise playing out in these caucuses and in Springfield. So it certainly doesn't help. And again, these are elected officials. You want them to be the leaders, the role models. You did have the top leaders in the House, so House Speaker Chris Welch and then Minority Leader Durkin did meet behind closed doors, talked it out some, but there really has been sort of a lot of ratcheting up the temperature, not just with masking, but with a lot of the provisions that you're seeing put before the General Assembly. So even if we're not going to see any sort of confrontations or maybe fewer swears, which by the way has happened before in Springfield, I've witnessed some of that for sure. I do think that before session is set to adjourn in April, you're going to see a lot of across the aisle fights, just verbal ones with everybody behind their desks, hopefully. The question is whether they'll remain masked. I guess we'll see how that plays out.
Playing nicely. Not the first time anybody's used profanity in Springfield, for sure. State Senator Tom Cullerton, he has resigned his seat. He is planning to plead guilty to embezzlement. Now, Paris, last week, Patrick Daley Thompson lost his aldermanic seat to a conviction. Now, another member of a political dynasty is going down with federal charges. Who is Tom Cullerton, and what is he pleading guilty to having done?
Well, he was a state senator from the western suburban area, Itasca, Glendale, that area. He is a cousin to former state Senate President John Cullerton, who has stepped down from his role a few years back. And as you mentioned, more than 3 dozen charges here of embezzlement in connection with this scheme to get paid a full salary from his former employer, the union, the Teamsters union, that is, and get health benefits and reimbursements, even though, according to this indictment, in this case, he didn't lift a finger and do a day's worth of work. He was busy being a state senator. So it's interesting, he initially pleaded not guilty. Today, changes that plea. It could either be that both sides were negotiating the terms of a plea deal and maybe they get his possible sentence down, possible charges down, or maybe it's a plea deal with cooperation, because there are so many cases tangential to this. The guy that allegedly arranged this sweetheart deal for him, John Coley, the former head of the Teamsters, Local 701, I believe, he's struck a plea deal in his own federal case. And then tangential to that is investigations into this TV studio, the Cinespace Studios on the southwest side. The former CEO of that, Alex Pisios, was reported to be an FBI mole. So there's like this tree trunk of federal cases or investigations, and then these branches, and then branches have branchlets, and maybe Cullerton knows something about any of that, and maybe he doesn't.
Nobody does it like Chicago or like Illinois. Here's
sorry, real quick, can I just point out, because Paris, I don't think you intended this, but Senate President John Cullerton just retired, backed away. It wasn't connected at all to this, wanting to make that clear.
Right, he stepped down. He retired.
Absolutely, thank you. So in the race to replace retiring Secretary of State Jesse White, somebody else who is retiring, Anna Valencia gets Governor Pritzker's support. Now, Heather, the governor he's bucking the Democratic Party's candidate, Alexi Giannoulias, to support Valencia. Explain who, among the party chose Giannoulias and how they come to pick him.
Well, it was the Cook County committee people who picked Giannoulias, but only by a very slight margin. So there were many people who felt like that endorsement was mixed at best. And I think the 1-2 punch this week of Jesse White, who is truly beloved among Chicagoans and statewide, who doesn't love the Jesse White tumblers, and Governor J.B. Pritzker, I think it means that we are going to see almost a 1-2 race between Anna Valencia and Alexi Giannoulias. Of course, Alderman David Moore is also running in this race. But if Governor Pritzker gets behind Anna Valencia with his millions of dollars of support, she could really make a run for it. Now, Alexi Giannoulias has been way out in front of the money race. So this is a big sea change for this race just in 1 week.
Amanda, what's going on here, politically? Is Pritzker staking his claim as party leader by bucking the party?
There might be an element of this, and it was particularly to do when the party went ahead and made endorsements, because committee people were supposed to have signed on to a pledge that say they would back whoever the party went behind. And then you have the governor of the state, who is, ostensibly the statewide Democratic Party leader, if not in name, but he certainly has the deep pockets to do so and to make an influence. So there's a degree of that. But if you also see Jesse White doing the same, I don't think this is an area where Pritzker is getting a whole ton of pushback. By the way, Janulius has previously had a bit of problems getting party backing. He sort of infamously or didn't get the backing of House Speaker Michael Madigan back when Madigan still had that position and was head of DPI. This is, I think, perhaps maybe a sign, however, of who Pritzker wants on his slate when he goes before voters. He wants to be with Valencia. It seems as if there might be some sort of uneasy feelings with being paired with Janulius on the slate.
Now, also on the election front, Mayor Lightfoot announced that she's now accepting applications for the 11th Ward seat. Heather, it's an open seat right now because, we already mentioned Patrick Daley Thompson's federal conviction and therefore his removal. What's the mayor's process here?
Well, she picked a 3-member committee to help advise her, and people can send in their applications for this seat, and she promised to review them. And she said that her target is to make her selection by March 23rd, which is when the city council will meet next. And this is not unlike how former Mayor Rahm Emanuel handled vacancies on the city council. Now, Mayor Lightfoot very carefully today did not commit to naming somebody who's an Asian American to fill this seat. The 11th Ward, regardless of what happens with the ward map elsewhere in the city, the 11th Ward will become Chicago's first ward with a majority of Asian voters. And she's under an intense amount of pressure to pick somebody who's Asian to fill in for Daley Thompson. But she said she doesn't know who's applied, so she doesn't know who the best person to fill that spot will be yet.
Now, the mayor's gang asset forfeiture ordinance, it failed to pass in city council today. Take a look at what the mayor said about the opposition to that proposal.
Sympathy for people who are literally spilling blood on our streets every single day is, quite frankly, hard for me to understand or fathom. And the notion that somehow this ordinance won't make a difference, or I've also heard that it's going to make matters worse. Tell that to the people living in neighborhoods, that they are terrified to come out of their homes, live a normal life, because they are afraid of gang violence.
Heather, what happened today?
Well, she just didn't have the votes, and she's hoping to lose the battle today, but win the war at another time. But as I was telling Paris earlier tonight, I just don't know what more she can do to convince alder people to get on board. And if she hasn't been able to close the deal with them to this point, in the face of such a deluge of opposition, I'm not sure that it will be any different in a month from now. But the mayor has been known to twist arms, and I wouldn't count anything out at this point.
Paris, talk a little bit about the politics of this, because obviously it seems like protecting gangs would be bad politically, but that's not what the opposition is arguing.
Well, and it's interesting, you don't see an opposition every day that consists of progressive groups and then the far-right leader of the FOP, John Catanzara. They were all in opposition to this, and the progressive groups were saying, the police department wanted this, but they didn't really present any evidence that it would lead to reduced homicides, and John Catanzara just called it kind of nonsense, political theater. It's also not every day that something passes committee and then doesn't pass the full city council. Usually it's like a rubber stamp after that, but the thing about the Public Safety Committee is you had a lot more sort of pro-police alder people there, and they got that through there, probably not as proportionally represented in the full city council, and then you see the result that you had today.
So also Andrea Kirsten's confirmation to lead COPA, that was approved by City Council today, as you reported earlier. Heather, in the end, was this a controversial vote, or did she sail through?
So she won by 31 votes with 14 against. And so that seems pretty lopsided, and it was. But there were many moments where her nomination was completely in peril because of COPA's release of the report that named Ella French the slain police officer and recommended she be disciplined. But Andrea Kirsten really was able to convince alder people that she had no choice to release that report. And she asked, do you really want a head of COPA who's willing to change reports for political sensitivities. And given everything that the city has seen with misconduct and cover-up, I think that was a compelling argument, especially for progressive aldermen, even if she couldn't win over the conservatives on the city council who really blasted her today in really harsh and personal terms at times.
Wow. And of course, as Paris mentioned earlier in the program, we are expecting to have the new COPA chief join us tomorrow night on the program. So we'll get to hear from her then. That is Spotlight Politics. Thanks to Heather Sharon, Amanda Vinicky, and Paris Schutz.